Confrontation we've been waiting for. The bruising battle of the big men for the 1984 National Championship. For Georgetown, the power centers on this man, Patrick Ewing, the dominating heart of the Hoya attack. But if anything, Ewing is even more intimidating on defense. And because of him, Georgetown's opponents drive to the basket at their own peril. But tonight, Ewing is up against a foe worthy of his steel. Houston star center Hakeem Abdul-Olajuwon. Hakeem and Ewing are without question the two most powerful big men in college basketball. And in a few moments, they will be going at each other off the boards for the first time ever, with nothing less than a national title at stake.
Isn't it amazing when Michigan can keep this game to a 19-foot 9-inch game inside that three-point line?
Let's talk a little bit more about that 84 Final Four. You mentioned getting out there to it. What stands out the most about that Kentucky game? Because I think the matchup between Hakeem and the championship, I think probably gets maybe the most press or the most remembrance. But that like you said, that Final Four game is just an incredible watch. If you ever get lately as an IU fan, you get a little sad sometimes about the teams more recently. I'll go watch a 1987 championship or Final Four and really feel the joy come back.
I was there in '87 for the IU Syracuse final. It was a remarkable game.
Nice.
Now this was also a great period for IU. Remember '81 they were in the Final Four. I think they lost to North Carolina one of the following years. So Georgetown gets through the West Regional. It was their second time in the West, so they got through it. They beat Dayton at one point, to get to the new UNLV and Dayton to get to the finals, and they're facing number 3 Kentucky, which was known at the time for having two centers. Sam Bowie, who was arguably the second best center in the country behind Ralph Sampson, and a 6'10" guy by the name of Melvin Turpin. Yeah. So Kentucky was a really,
Both guys
really good team.
went to the pros too. Mel Turpin went to the pros too.
So they also had a guard by the name of Dickie Beal, who was didn't play as much in the pros, but he was a great college guard. And so Kentucky was a formidable opponent. That game was played at the Kingdome was torn down about 20 years ago, but it was a big old concrete stadium, sat like 50,000.
Yeah.
And that was the second game on the docket that afternoon before it followed the Houston Virginia game, which was won by Houston in their third consecutive Final Four.
Yep.
So Georgetown's playing Kentucky. Ewing gets into early foul trouble. Kentucky's up 27-12 with 8 minutes to go. And people are like, oh, this is not going to end well because Kentucky is a team that really plays up to it. John's approach at the time was, don't worry, we'll get Patrick back for the second half. Just play better defense. Okay? So 27-15, Georgetown scores the last 7 points of the first half. Now, again, for your audience, realize there's no three-point play, there's no shot clock. So 27-22 is not unusual. It's a little bit slow, but that's your halftime score. The second half opens with something that is remarkable in that it has never happened since in college basketball. Kentucky, this is a very good Kentucky team, one of the best offenses in the country, does not score for the first 10 minutes of the second half.
Wow.
They missed their first 10 shots in the second half, and at that point, Georgetown had taken the lead. They proceeded to shoot 3 for 33 in the second half, 9%. Okay, and lose the game 53-40. So they scored 13 points in the second half, 6 by field goal and 7 by free throw.
Wow.
And Joe B. Hall could not understand it. I remember seeing him after the game walk through a hallway, and he had this look on his face like, what just happened?
Shot because Ewing was there in the vicinity. Oh, there's swarming defense everywhere. About as awesome display of defense against a quality team as I have ever seen in college basketball.
I mean, you're the number 3 team in the country. You've got at least 2 NBA draft picks on your team, and you proceed to miss 30 of 33 shots.
Crazy.
And a lot of it was Georgetown's defense, just forcing them to take bad shots. And 33 shots in 20 minutes is not unusual for the time. Mm-hmm. And they weren't bad shots. It wasn't like they were taking 35-foot shots. They missed layups. They missed close ins. They were so rattled by the defensive efforts that Georgetown had provided. And you could just see the confidence drain out of them. You go 10 minutes without a basket, then they score, then they go another 7 minutes without a basket. So literally entering the final 4 minutes of that game, they had 2 field goals in the second half. And with that, Georgetown wins the game by 13 and goes on to play Houston in a game which was relatively close. Georgetown was leading throughout most of the game, but that Kentucky game opened a lot of eyes to, wow, what a defensive stop that was against a team that had really overwhelmed its opponents in the tournament. And if you look back upon how Kentucky did leading up to that, they manhandled a lot of their teams. So they're up 12 on Georgetown late in the first half, and all of a sudden it's halftime, and they flatline.
Just suffocated.
And you really do not see that certainly not in today's basketball, but they shot 9% in the second half.
That is crazy.
And that's a lot. I mean, that is defense. That is not Kentucky wasn't playing well. Kentucky lost its that was defensive stops up and down the court.
So what was it like watching Ewing go up against Hakeem at the time? Because I think that they had this legendary battle then in the pros too, and a lot of people might know about that. But the fact that they went up against each other in college is so fascinating to think about, because they just became two of the all-time greats, and it rarely plays out that way. That that great also translates into all-time great in the pros.
Just my opinion as a fan. I think Olajuwon became a better player in the pros than he was in college. He was more of a project player at Houston. I think that's part of that is because of the way that team was run. There's an excellent documentary that ESPN did about the '83 Phi Slamma Jamma team. And how Benny Anders, and if you've seen that one pass, if it's deflected, how everything changes with that program. But they were coming into their third Final Four. They came so close the year before. I think there was a feeling on that team that they just couldn't get over the hill. Ewing was the better man that night. Olajuwon had to do a lot. He was frustrated by a bigger man inside. A lot of the Houston offenses at that time did not roll through Olajuwon. For example, Clyde Drexler earlier, he was the guy that moved it along. So Olajuwon is still growing into the kind of player he could be. But this is just me talking. It's not necessarily fact. I just when I looked at them, I saw that he was very much an important part, but he was not the player on that team the way he could have been. If Guy Lewis had really made him the focal point. Now people can disagree. I understand that, but in that game, I think Ewing basically played him to at worst a draw and had the better of him. Georgetown got a great performance out of a little-known freshman by the name of Michael Graham in that game opened up that game. Graham we could
do a whole other podcast on him.
Yeah, I mean he averaged 5 points a game. Was never disqualified for a game. People had this idea he was this complete, troublemaker, and he was never that. But yes, he's a whole other story. He had a great game in that final. Also, Reggie Williams, the freshman, was the player of the game. But I think Ewing was a better player that day. As Ewing went on to the Knicks, and as Olajuwon went on to the Rockets, I think Olajuwon really built up his ability to own the floor in ways he did not in college.
After they win, what is the perception then? How does it change? Because it seems like eventually the sort of perception of Thompson, the program, everything has this kind of shift where he becomes this kind of almost grandfatherly figure, the way that he's embraced and thought about. And certainly it's deserved. I just think that it's so interesting, to have this almost villainous storyline written about you, and then to just do what you've always been doing and have it totally turn around into almost the exact opposite.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways that's the kind of the arc of his coaching, that he was not well known when he got the job. He was a high school coach. He had never coached in college.
That's so crazy.
He takes the job. It was $20,000 a year. John was a capitalist. He used to say that the world was not black and white, but shades of green. And so it was important to him to, make money. Georgetown could not really pay him a lot.
Yeah.
And so that's where the alliance with Nike allowed him the ability to build up his wealth in ways that Georgetown could not. And yet he was someone who was really taught at a very early age to make sure that you stood up for yourselves. And so he would not back down for those who might question what he was doing. There were times where he was, he would get in his own way sometimes. There were a number of great players where he would not recruit them. Well, I'll give you an example. Kenny Anderson, who NBA, wanted to come to Georgetown. John Thompson would not visit Kenny Anderson's house. He says, I don't go to recruits' houses. You want to come to talk to me? Come to the campus.
Interesting.
And so, guess what? Kenny Anderson goes elsewhere.
Yeah.
Georgetown lost Grant Hill. It lost Dennis Scott, Rasheed Wallace, because John said, "Look, this is how I recruit.
Yeah.
If you want to do it this way, you come and talk to me. But if you don't, go somewhere else."
Very interesting.
So that lost him the opportunity in the 90s. I mean, where is this team in the 90s with a lineup that included Dennis Scott, Kenny Anderson, Alonzo Mourning, Dikembe Mutombo, and Grant Hill?
Sounds like a good lineup.
Yeah. So it did not happen. The Mutombo story was he was alerted to Mutombo through a member of the U.S. International Aid Group that says, "Hey, there's a kid down here. You need to." John's not flying to the Congo to see him. He says, "Is he good? Yes. Is he tall? Yes. Well, let's talk. I want to find out more about him." And brought him to the U.S. Under a chance to. He did not play his first year. He came to school and basically was in the classroom the first year, in part because in his country they didn't offer the SATs.
Oh wow!
So he could speak 4 languages, but the SAT was not offered there. So things like that added to the perception that John always kind of had these secret recruits out there.
Right.
So I think he did not dissuade those people who wanted to take a prejudiced view of him, because it did not matter to him. What mattered to him was that he was standing up for what he believed in, and in doing so was successful at it.
It's so crazy. I mean, what an amazing run in the 80s and even on into the 90s. Like you said, I just kind of astounded by what he built there and the
I mean their overall record in the 80s was 268 and 69.
It's just crazy.
So if you do the math on that, I mean they won 6 Big East titles. They had gone to 3 Final Fours. Narrowly missed the 87 Final Four with Providence College. Narrowly missed the 89 Final Four on Duke. They came very close. Even the year before Ewing got there in 1980, it's a forgotten one. Georgetown won the inaugural Big East title. They beat Maryland in the regional semifinals, which Maryland's was ranked number 4 in the country. They play Iowa in the regional final, lead by 15 at the half, lose on a 3-point play with 5 seconds to go, and did not make the Final Four. So as the longtime radio voice of the Georgetown program, Rich Shavotkin, would say, there's been a lot of great moments, but a lot of heartbreak. He saw them all, and John saw them all. But I think, John got to a point where he saw that the college basketball landscape was changing. So he resigns in 1999, essentially at the age of 58, and did what many coaches could not do, which was enjoy the life of an elder statesman. And so many coaches want to hang on and hang on and hang on more. And there is something to be said for that coach that walks away and still is connected to the game. John was a radio announcer for many years in the Washington area, which is the amusing part was he hated the press, didn't he? No, he's a radio. He hosted an afternoon radio show.
My primary concern as a coach is to protect and to teach and to do the things that I have to do for my players. And I think that your role as a representative of the media is to describe that. You understand? And I think that where I fall into a problem sometimes with the media is that I think that they try to determine the things that I do. They're supposed to describe it, not to direct it. If Thompson is the craziest man in the world, never let him in. Say he's the craziest man, never let him in, but don't get him to change.
He did Westwood 1 college basketball games with Bill Rafter.
Yeah.
who he had played against in college.
Oh,
Raftery
really?
was a great forward at LaSalle in the 60s.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
And so he did that, and he was able to kind of stay around in the game, much like, Raftery left Seton Hall at like the age of like 39.
Right, yeah.
Has enjoyed this great career,
Still,
but a lot of
still
guys
going.
and a lot of guys don't want to do that. They want to stay into their 60s and 70s. He didn't want to do that, and so it allowed him 20 years to kind of do what he wanted in life. And the Washington book is interesting because I think in his later years he saw where things were headed.
Mm-hmm.
He had mobility issues at the time, and he wasn't getting around as much. And he wanted to have a book that would tell his story the way he wanted it to be told.
Mm-hmm.
20 years earlier, he was going to do a book on an autobiography with a gentleman by the name of Ralph Wiley.
Okay.
And if your readers or your viewers don't know about Ralph Wiley, look him up. He was a remarkable reporter for Sports Illustrated.
Okay.
He was a great reporter. He died young in 2004. But John saw the final version of the book and said, I don't want this book. And they were stuck. They had done the whole book, and he says, I don't want it. And so the book was never published. So he goes to Jesse Washington in 2016, 2017 and says, let me tell you my story. It is the story of John Thompson, the way John Thompson wanted it to be said. There's a lot in that book. There's a lot not in that book. He doesn't talk about his wife, his kids, why he did certain things. It was just kind of setting the case for why he did what he did. So it's an autobiography, but it's also an unusual one in that there's no book tour. There's no appearances on TV to talk about it, no questions and answers. He died 3 months before it was published. And I think he wanted to go out with his version of the story. Yeah. And it's got a lot of good things in it. It talks more about civil rights and those issues than probably he did as a coach, but that he still had an opinion on. Yeah. But again, it's the final word, because who's going to argue? Who's going to write a book that's going to go contrary to what John said about himself? Yeah. So that becomes kind of the last book on Thompson. There's 4 books that have been written about the program, but I don't think there'll be one on Thompson going forward, because you run into the fact that, well, he's already written the book. Right. Yeah. But he chose his subjects carefully. Yeah. There's a few things in that book that I never knew about as a fan or as a writer, but they're few and far between. Many of the stories he told had been told in other media, but I think he wanted, as he said in the book, to tell the story to his grandkids.
Well, tell us where people can find more information about you, and then if you got another book recommendation too on Georgetown, I'm always looking for stuff to read. So the
website is www.hoyabasketball.com. That's the historical archive. The daily coverage of Georgetown basketball is at Hoyasaxa, HOYASAXA.com, which is the college cheer, and that's updated daily.
I wonder what that was.
Yeah, so think of it much like the Virginia Tech Hokie cheer, or
I got it now.
The very rock chalk, whatever the case may be. So Hoyasaxa.com for the daily coverage, and Hoyabasketball.com for the archive coverage. And if readers have an opportunity to learn more about that, what Georgetown basketball was like in the 80s and 90s, and they can find it on Amazon or other places. There's a book by former Washington Post reporter Leonard Shapiro called Big Man on Campus, which is very fair, but also points into things that John did that probably didn't make it to the Jesse Washington book. When Henry Holt was the publisher, wanted to take an ad out in the Game Time program, Georgetown would not accept the ad. They hadn't even seen the book, but they didn't even want to let people know the book existed. Interesting. And it was published in 1991. Okay. And yet, it like I said, it was a tough but fair view of this. And Shapiro had known Thompson back since high school, since he was coaching high school ball. And so that's always a good opportunity to kind of read about a reporter's view of how John ran the program. Yeah. And in the end, it's not disparaging, right? But it also paints a fair view of what he was like. And there are those who worshipped him, and there were other people in his community that thought he was, we don't want anything to do with him. It was that dichotomy of who he was that made him such a fascinating person, both as a coach and a phrase that he liked to use in university company, that he was more than a coach. He'd like to say, I'm an educator. Yeah. And all of that entailed. For sure. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us. And, I hope that if we get into the 90s, one of these times, we'll get you back on, talk a little bit more about that kind of Mourning Mutombo, Iverson era of the program as well. Thank you very much. Okay.
Now, I understand there's been some criticism, Coach Thompson, that maybe your coaching was a little too stringent or almost military. I wouldn't let that bother me at all. It's results that pay off. You've won the title. You've never let, and this I think is vitally important as much so as the title, you have never let these young men forget that there is something more important for their being at Georgetown than basketball.
It should have Hoya paranoia on it, because that's what they called us all year. But I'd like to give you this shirt.
Thank you for listening to the 19-9 podcast. If you haven't already subscribed to the podcast, make sure you do. And while you're at it, leave us a rating or review. 5 stars only, like the basketball camp. We also have links to all of 19-9 social media so you never miss a release. Until next time,